2. Ukraine, a land of blue sky and yellow fields, a modern nation pressed between two worlds. The people who call the lands of Ukraine home, or consider themselves Ukrainian, only, in recent history can truly make such a claim. In the mid-negative 19th century through 1921, a concept of Ukrainian nationalism emerged in the midst of multinational empires. A concept of nationalism that culminated in the establishment of various Ukrainian states in Eastern Europe. There were different eras of Ukrainian nationalism and a multitude of influences which shaped how Ukrainians viewed their own nationalism. The ultimate failure of the Ukrainian revolutions towards the end of the Russian Civil War and the establishment of Poland did put a pause in the Ukrainian national movement. These Ukrainian nationalistic bodies did, however, lay the foundations for the modern and independent state of Ukraine, a nation where the ideas of nationalism from the past combine with those from the present, and in a way resume where the Ukrainian Revolution of 1917 to 1921 came to a halt. While Ukrainian nationalism ultimately failed to establish and build upon the foundations laid in the mid-negative 19th and early 20th century, it was a critical moment for the Ukrainian national movement. The history of Ukraine is one which is complex and intertwined with multiple other histories. As a result of this, it is difficult to say exactly when Ukrainians became a distinct ethnic group, and Ukrainian nationalism took root. Many historians begin to chronicle the history of modern Ukraine in the 860s when Prince Rurik founded his dynasty according to the tale of bygone years. There is a reason for this, of course, and that is historians have in the past viewed the Kievan Rus as the precursor to not only Ukraine but also Russia and Belarus. Though, as will be shown, this is a faulty era to begin to claim the origins of Ukrainian nationalism. In 1848, revolutions of nationalism and a desire for change swept through Central Europe. While the main events of the revolutions of 1848 did undoubtedly take place in Central Europe, change did make its way east into Eastern Europe. In the region of Galicia, a province in Habsburg Austria, a minority of Ukrainians experiment with creating a new Ukrainian identity. These Ukrainians in Galicia are considered to have laid the foundations for Ukrainian nationalism in the 20th century. Further expansion of nationalism occurred in 1906. At this time, Little Russians were granted limited freedoms towards creating an identity separate from the Russians. These experiments with nationalism under the supervision of empires culminated in the Ukrainian Revolution when both the Austro-Hungarian and Russian empires collapsed in 1917 and 1918.3. A sense of nationalism developed into Ukrainian states. Ukrainians declared independence from empires and national states alike. Nationalism was seemingly leading towards a land for Ukrainians to call their own. The Ukrainian Revolution, however, was short-lived. Due to Ukrainian factionalism, Ukrainian political turmoil, foreign invasion, and the geopolitical situation of post-war Europe, Ukraine is a state which failed to forge its own future. Over the next 70 years, Ukrainians and the lands of Ukraine were once again under the control of various entities. The USSR originally kept what the Russian Empire claimed. Poland received Galicia once again. When Germany invaded Poland, and subsequently the USSR, Ukraine was brought under their influence. After World War II, Ukraine was once again claimed by the USSR. The foundations which had been laid in the 19th and early 20th century had, however, not been forgotten. The memory of the Ukrainian Revolution and the idea of an independent Ukraine did become a reality with the Declaration of Ukrainian Independence in 1991. The historiography of Ukrainian history and/or Ukrainian nationalism is a complex matter. There are works which positively focus on the topics of Ukrainian history. Nationalism. One Little Russian, or Малороссия, was a term used to describe Ukrainians who lived within the borders of Imperial Russia, similar to how the Ukrainians of Poland, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and Austria were called Ruthenians. 2. Jacobus Delwade. Identity and Geopolitics. Ukraine's grappling with imperial legacies. Harvard Ukrainian Studies 32/33, number 1, 2011, 179-207, 185, 3. Serhiy Yakelchik, Ukraine, Birth of a Modern Nation, Oxford, Oxford University Press, 2007, 67, 4. And Identity. These works are, however, typically associated with the Ukrainian Studies Institute or a professor of Ukrainian studies. leaving limited options outside of established institutions. An example of the limited options is Ukraine, a history by Orest Subtelny, or the roots of Ukrainian nationalism. Galicia is Ukraine's Piedmont by Paul R. Magaxi, both of which are insightful books into the eras and elements of Ukrainian history, nationalism, and identity, but each come from the University of Toronto Press. On the other side of the spectrum is the discussion of Ukrainian history, nationalism, and identity to add to a larger discussion on the Russky Mir. For in this context, Ukrainian studies are typically briefly mentioned, as such mentions are seen to further advance the study of Russian history, sometimes through mechanisms such as claiming ownership of the Kievan Rus as being Russian, 5 other times through viewing Ukraine as a mere extension of Russia. This style of historiography could be considered the traditional method for studying Ukrainian history, nationalism, or identity due to centuries of those writing the histories of such topics coming from Russian intelligentsia or scholars. Examples of this would be works such as Civil War in South Russia, 1919 to 1920, The Defeat of the Whites, or A History of 20th Century Russia by Peter Kennes and Robert Service, respectively. While there are certainly deviations, outliers, and independent sources for the exploration of Ukrainian history, nationalism, and identity, the above-mentioned trends are what is typical at this moment in time. There are, however, primary sources available which allow for the historiography to be expanded upon in ways which may have yet to be covered. Political documents from the various factions within Ukraine during the revolution are available. Manifestos and declarations are available. Documents from the nationalists in the West, documents from the Central Rada in Kyiv, to Bolshevik and Ukrainian socialists can all be used. For Russky Mir, Ruski Mir translates to Russian World 5. Delwade, Identity and Geopolitics. 5. To expand on the available picture the historiography has painted. So, while the historiography of Ukrainian history, nationalism, and identity is small compared to other histories, there is still ample opportunity to expand how we view these Ukrainian topics. While this essay is by no stretch of the imagination a professional piece of scholarly work, I do want to explore the roots of Ukrainian nationalism in a historical context. Through the use of documents created during the Ukrainian Revolution, articles made available to me, and various books, I am striving to explore this topic, which not only interests me but is also an important topic to understand given the recent Russian invasion of Ukraine. The essay will be split into 3 sections. The first section is meant to be a brief survey of Ukrainian history, nationalism, and identity up to 1848. While this section does not weigh heavily on my main field of research, it is important to have background information on Ukraine. The second and first main section will cover Ukrainian nationalism and the history of it in the face of the revolutions of 1848 and to 1917. The third section will cover Ukrainian nationalism during the Ukrainian Revolution. This section is meant to be the center point of my research. I intend to explore not only what Ukrainian nationalism meant during the 4 years of the revolution, but also how it fit in with the larger world picture in the post-World War I period. I hope to provide some original insight into this topic through the use of documents from this last period. By analyzing this aspect of European history, I seek to provide a different perspective on the discussion of nationalism, as well as provide insight on how the current situation in Ukraine developed. The origins of a Ukrainian state have traditionally been traced back to the foundation, Kievan Rus. The Kievan Rus was a medieval state founded by Prince Rurik of Novgorod, a Norseman who settled in northern Russia. Through treachery and deception, Oleg of Novgorod, 6, seized the city of Kiev and declared that it should be the mother of Russian cities. 6. Through conquest and diplomacy, the Varangians of the Rurikid dynasty came to control a large area of land. With this land came a plethora of tribes and people, a number of which were Slavs. The ruling Norse, who later became more and more Slavic as generations passed, were in contact with Constantinople, Norse in Scandinavia, Arabs, and Western Europe. From this they formed an impressive medieval state, though the stability of the state was constantly in danger due to infighting and outside threats. The medieval state of the Kievan Rus saw one of the first major divisions in the latter half of the 11th century. Paul R. Magaxi notes in The Roots of Ukrainian Nationalism, Galicia, as Ukraine's Piedmont, this divergence of control and influence can be traced back to the Formation of the Rostislav dynasty. 7. As grandson to Yaroslav the Wise, Prince Rostislav was tied to the heritage of Kiev, but his domain became distinct from other lands of the Rus. Orest Subtelny in his work Ukraine, a history mentions that the region of Galicia under the Rostislav dynasty became distinct enough to be the first of the Kievan Rus principalities to break away from Kiev, though this independence was short-lived. After the Rostislav dynasty grew weak, after only a handful of generations the region was wrestled away by Roman the Great, Mstislavich, when Galicia was merged with Volhynia in 1199. While the dynasty that Roman the Great established in West Ukraine did come to an end in 1340 with the assassination of Boleslav of Mazowia, the region was plunged into a 52-year-long conflict which saw the lands being split between Poland and Lithuania, despite the dissolution of a Kievan Rus principality. 6. Nestor the Chronicler, the Russian primary chronicle Laurentian text. Trans Samuel Hazard Cross and Olgierd P. Shervowitz-Wetzer, Cambridge, The Medieval Academy of America, 1953, 61.7. Paul R. Magoxy, The Roots of Ukrainian Nationalism, Galicia as Ukraine as Piedmont, Toronto, University of Toronto Press, 2002, 5. 8. Orest Subtelny, Ukraine, A History, Toronto, published by the University of Toronto Press in association with the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, 1988, 59. 9. Orest Subtelny, Ukraine, A History, 60, 7, which lasted 100 years after the fall of the Kievan Rus. In the late 14th century, a distinct identity was formed during this period. As Orest Subtelny puts it, the Romanoviches preserved for Ukrainians a sense of cultural and political distinctiveness. This distinctiveness would be of crucial importance to their survival as a separate national entity in the difficult times yet to come. 10. So, while a sense of Ukrainian nationalism may not directly come from the Kievan Rus state, it is still important to mention this period of time as it does have lasting effects. By the dawning of the 15th century, the lands of Ukraine were no longer a state for Ukrainians. In the north, the Muscovite Principality was forming its own identity, further separating from the ancestral seat of power in Kiev. The Poles and Lithuanians were seizing land on the Ukrainian steppes, while the Mongols' Golden Horde were still situated in parts of Eastern Europe, including Ukrainian lands. In essence, the Slavs of Ukraine had become a stateless people and once again found themselves subjected to other states. Serhiy Yakelchik does, however, argue in Ukraine, Birth of a Modern Nation, this state of existence did not spell the end for Ukrainian identity. Between the eras of the Kievan Rus and the Cossack period, some Ruthenian elite did maintain a distinction from the Poles and Lithuanians. 11. In 1649, a Cossack state, called the Cossack Hetman, was established after conflict with Poland. The autonomous Ukrainian Cossack state did not last, however. 55 years after signing the Pereyaslav Treaty, which placed the Tsar as protector of the Hetman, Russia defeated Swedish and Cossack forces, which saw Ukrainian autonomy decrease even more than it had in the years prior. 12. The Cossacks Hetman did carry on in the memory of Ukrainians living under Tsarist rule in later years, acting. 10. Orest Subtelny, Ukraine, A History, 65. 11. Serhiy Yakelchik, Ukraine, Birth of a Modern Nation, 25. 12. Serhiy Yakelchik, Ukraine, Birth of a Modern Nation, 29. 8. As a foundational piece to expand Ukrainian nationalism and identity in the 19th and 20th century. 13. The period of time between 1848 and 1917 is an important era in the development of Ukrainian nationalism and identity, considering the rising idea of nationalism amongst many groups within Europe at the time. Ukrainians soon found themselves experimenting with their own nationalism as well. The spring of 1848 brought change to Ukrainian nationalism through larger changes which occurred to the Austrian Empire. Due to relaxed control after 1848, the Ukrainians in the region were able to begin experimenting with their own identity. In 1906, when the Tsarist government slightly relaxed its control over Ukrainians, a similar experiment of Russian-Ukrainian nationalism took place. These experimentations culminated with the Ukrainian Revolution in 1917, the event which took Ukrainian nationalism from an experiment to being a center point for a new nation. When Central Europe was rocked by the political chaos brought by the spring of 1848, the winds of change blew east into the Ukrainian province of Galicia. Since coming under the control of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and later the Austrian Empire, Ukrainians remained a sizable minority in the region. Yet, being seen as a minority, they were allowed little voice which they could express national interest. In 1848, the Ukrainians were given an unlikely opportunity. The Austrian Empire not only allowed them to take nationalistic actions, but supported such actions. 14. Though still firmly under the control of Habsburg Austria, the Ukrainians were allowed to become politically active as well as being allowed to build a Ruthenian intelligentsia. As a result of the turmoil caused by the revolutions of 1848, the Austrians sought to integrate Ukraine's Piedmont. 58. 13. Serhiy Yakelchik, Ukraine, birth of a modern nation. 30. 14. Paul Armagoxy, the roots of Ukrainian nationalism. Galicia as Ukraine. 9. Into the empire, a little more than had been done in the past. The Ukrainians were allowed to form political bodies at this time, some of which were local political bodies. Some were able to represent Galician Ukrainians in the Reichstag. At this time, Ukrainian became a language which literature was being produced in. Social organizations were created with the goal of sponsoring a Ukrainian community. The Ukrainians were even able to have their language and literature become an official field of study in the University of Lviv. All this is to say that the Ukrainians of Galicia were taking massive strides towards nationalism, strides which would be of great importance later on down the road. Paul Armagoxy points out in his book The Roots of Ukrainian Nationalism, Galicia as Ukraine's Piedmont, that following the spring of 1848, Ukrainians did become active within the Austrian government. After the founding of the Austrian Parliament, Ukrainians from Galicia were made active members within the parliament. 15. Through this involvement, Ukrainian political parties were formed, political parties which declared that their ultimate goal was independent statehood. 16. Ukrainians in Galicia were involved in the Galician Diet, on multiple occasions going toe-to-toe with the Polish population of Galicia in an attempt to secure increasing Ukrainian influence over the Ukrainian population and land. Anne Applebaum points out that the political expression of Ukrainians was successful enough that from 1899 onward the Ukrainian National Democratic Party was able to operate and compete with the Poles freely. 17. A party that did see limited success despite a system rigged in the favor of the Poles in Galicia. While the tangible achievements of Ukrainians in the political world are limited in regards to securing nationalist achievements, it is important to note how, when working with the limited 15. Paul Armagoxy, The Roots of Ukrainian Nationalism, Galicia as Ukraine's Piedmont. 58.16. Orest Subtelny, Ukraine, A History. 327. 17. Anne Applebaum, Red Famine, Stalin's War on Ukraine, New York, Doubleday, 2017, 09. 16. Orest Subtelny, Ukraine, A History. 327. 17. Anne Applebaum, Red Famine, Stalin. 10. Resources at their disposal. The Ukrainians were able to take steps towards forming a national identity through politics. Where the Ukrainians in Galicia made leaps and bounds in regards to nationalism was in the intellectual and communal aspect of life. Considering that the Ukrainians had been a stateless people for 200 years at the very least, it is unfair to expect the Ukrainians to have been able to establish a state for themselves immediately after 1848. However, when the Habsburgs allowed nationalism to be experimented with in less politically influential areas, the Ukrainians pounced on the opportunity. Within a year and a half of the events of the spring of 1848, the Ukrainians in Galicia had published their own newspaper in Ukrainian. Ukrainians were soon publishing literary works in Ukrainian, teaching classes ranging from primary school to university in Ukrainian. The Ukrainians in Galicia were able to found social organizations which sought to help educate the Ukrainian peasantry and form a sense of community with one another. By 1914, reaching levels of involvement that just one of these organizations, the Prosvita Society, had 77 branches, 3,000 reading rooms, and over 360,000 members. 18. Most importantly, though a select number of Ukrainians became members of the intelligentsia, though relatively small in number, the Galician intelligentsia would become the main champions of Ukrainian nationalism. The intelligentsia, made up mostly of members of the clergy and some educated Ukrainians, would experiment with what it meant to be Ukrainian. These intelligentsia experimented with concepts that would stimulate Ukrainians in the future, and to a degree their experimentation with what it means to be a Ukrainian national would be foundational for the Ukrainian nationals. During the Ukrainian Revolution, across the Galician borders and within the bulk of what is now Ukraine, a different experiment with nationalism was occurring for the Ukrainians of the Tsar's lands. The 18 Orest Subtelny, Ukraine, A History, 324. 11. Ukrainians of the East arguably inherited a system steeped in aristocratic and feudalistic systems, a system where loyalty to the Tsar in St. Petersburg was seen as being nationalistic. Capital A. System where Ukrainians could be seen as being disloyal and anti-Russian if they attempted to express their own culture. In Russian Ukraine, instruments for nationalism such as schooling, language, and literature were limited because of Russification or social position of the Ukrainians. The power to implement political change was limited. Even the intelligentsia were not always safe to experiment with what it meant to be a Ukrainian in Tsarist Russia. Despite the issues, the Ukrainians of Russia did take steps towards forming ideas of nationalism, ideas which did prove necessary for the Ukrainian Revolution. One issue with determining what it meant to be Ukrainian in the mid-19th century was that Ukraine had not had a state of its own in at least 200 years. Nearly 600 if the fall of the Kievan Russes is used as the baseline for a Ukrainian state over the Cossacks of the 17th century. Because of this, there is an inherent reliance on soft factors for forming nationalism, such as schools, language, or literature to establish a national identity. The issue with reliance on these soft factors was that they are inherently easier to control than a sense of nationalism that stems from belonging to an established nation. The Russian government did establish schools in Ukraine, but they were meant to serve a purpose for Russia rather than to Ukrainians. Serhiy Yakelchik goes on to say, in Ukraine, birth of a modern nation, that one such institution for learning, Kyiv University, acted as a citadel of Russian schooling in a land with a minority of Russians. 19. When Ukrainian studies did take place, it was often amongst a small circle of intelligentsia, most of which were rarely of peasant origins. 20. Though the studies of Ukrainian history did lay the foundation for Ukrainian nationalism within Russian Ukraine. This. 19. Serhiy Yakelchik, Ukraine, Birth of a Modern Nation. 41. 20. Orest Subtelny, Ukraine, A History. 223. 24. 12. Was mostly done to draw Ukrainians closer to the Russians and act as a means to pull them away from Polish or Austrian influence. 21. Language suffered through being seen as merely a dialect of Russian, and shortly after Ukrainian literature was being produced in Ukrainian, the Russian government began to crack down on the Ukrainians. Publications on Ukraine that were Ukrainophilic in nature were banned, and writers, publishers, or Ukrainian thinkers were not allowed to publish pro-Ukrainian works under threat of job loss, arrest, or exile. 22. This is not to say that under such conditions Ukrainian nationalism and identity did not form. Orest Subtelny does state that during the first half of the 19th century, Eastern Ukraine took its turn in playing the leading role in Ukrainian cultural development, showing that even when these factors came about in Tsarist Russia, there was an effect on national identity. 23. However, when compared to the West, these factors went through various stages of stability and appear to have been widespread compared to Galicia. Another aspect of Tsarist Russia was the political order of the day. Russia was a feudal state technically until 1861, when Alexander II emancipated the serfs of his empire. Due to this, being the situation, being a noble meant a great deal in achieving political success in Russia. Why did this present an issue for the Ukrainians and prevent them from being involved politically? This is because the Ukrainians were seen as a noblesse people on account of no Ukrainian state having existed in 200 years or more. 24. In the event that there was Ukrainian nobility, it was more likely than not that they would assimilate into Russian society. This means that in most regards, the leaders of the Eastern Ukrainian national movements were the intelligentsia, most of whom were Ukrainians. However, some were Russian or Poles. One such. 21. Paul R. Magaksy, The Roots of Ukrainian Nationalism. Galicia as Ukraine as Piedmont. 48. 22. C. Yakelchik 42-45. Subtelny 235-37. Magaksy 49. 23. Orest Subtelny, Ukraine, A History. 231. 24 Orest Subtelny, Ukraine, A History, 223. 13. Group of intelligentsia was the Kryl and Methodius Brotherhood, a group of educated men who sought to lead Ukrainians towards a better future away from the clutches of the Russian Empire. Not surprisingly, the group was hunted down, disbanded, and the members charged with various crimes. However, due to the radical nature of their goals, the most prominent member, Marinsky Shevchenko, was exiled for 10 years to the Russian Far East and was prohibited from writing or drawing during his exile. 25. On the other hand, there was the more successful Kiev Hromada, a social group dedicated to the Ukrainian culture and mass enlightenment of the peasant population. An important development of this society was developing connections with Ukrainians in Galicia who were doing the same things, albeit under different circumstances. Few events in history occur from thin air. More often than not, there needs to be a series of events that lead up to the event in question. For the Ukrainian Revolution of 1917-21, these foundational events can firmly be traced back to the 19th century when Ukrainian nationalism began to take hold in both the Austrian and Russian Empire. As a result of different influences, the sense of identity developed differently in each Ukrainian region. Moving forward, it is important to understand where Ukrainian nationalism came from, why Ukrainian sense of identity may differ, and the general situation each area found themselves in at the start of the Ukrainian revolutions. World War I will go down in history as one of the most calamitous events known to man. World War I started in part due to rising nationalism throughout Europe in the preceding decades, making it somewhat ironic that the Ukrainian states, the Ukrainian fulfillment of nationalism, and a new identity were born due to an event sparked by nationalism elsewhere. World War I brought the collapse of the Austrian, now Austro-Hungarian, and Russian Empire in 1917 and 1918. Subjected Ukrainians now found themselves with an opportunity to forge a new nation of their own. This 25 Orest Subtelny, Ukraine, A History, 234-37. 14. Period is known as the Ukrainian Revolution. For nearly 5 years, the Ukrainians of the East and the West sought to establish their own state through geopolitics, local alliances, internal politics, and military action. The Ukrainians did what they could to establish their new state. In the aftermath of Tsar Nicholas II's abdication, there was much uncertainty within the former empire. The empire was one in which only roughly half of the population was ethnically Russian, leaving half of the population in a state where independence or incorporation to the new state were equally viable options. 26. When the provincial government took power, there was recognition that regional autonomy in theory was allowed, the region of Ukraine being included. In regions which were eligible for autonomy, 27. At first there were Ukrainians who supported the provincial government. Serhiy Yakelchik notes one newly formed political group, the Executive Committee of United Civic Organizations, as being one of the Ukrainian groups supporting the provincial government. 28. However, because the provincial government allowed the right to assembly after taking power from the Tsar, it did not take long for less supportive groups to come out of their underground meetings and hide to make their own voices heard on the future of Ukraine. When the Ukrainian Central Rada formed in the third week of March, it sought to act as a central platform for all Ukrainian parties to have a voice. The provincial government initially rejected the establishment of the Ukrainian Central Rada. In return, the UNR declared independence from the provincial government. 29. On the 10th of June, 1917, in their first manifesto, the UNR declared Ukrainian independence, stating, in their manifesto the UNR states, 26. Peter Kenez, Civil War in South Russia, 1919-1920, The Defeat of the Whites, Berkeley, published for the Hoover Institution on War, Revolution, and Peace, by University of California Press, 1977, 140.27. Peter Kenez, Civil War in South Russia, 144, 28. Serhiy Yakelchik, Ukraine, Birth of a Modern Nation, 68, 29. Johannes Remy, It is unknown where the Little Russians are heading to. The autonomy dispute between the Ukrainian Central Rada and the All-Russian Provisional Government in 1917. The Slavonic and East European, Review 95, Number 4, 2017, 691-719, 691, 27. Peter Kenez, Civil War in South Russia, 144. 28. Serhiy Yakelchik, Ukraine, Birth of a Modern Nation, 68. 29. Johannes Remy, 15. Let Ukraine be free. The Central Russian government did not want to have our commissioner with it, did not want to create a new system with us, and now, Ukrainian people, we are forced to create our own destiny, when the provisional Russian government cannot bring order to us, when it does not want to join us in doing great work, we must take it upon ourselves. It is our duty to our land and to the peoples who live on our land. From now on, every village, every volast, every county or zemstvo council that stands for the interests of the Ukrainian people must have the closest organizational relations with the Central Council. 30. In their bid for autonomy, the Ukrainian Central Rada felt it was necessary to do things on their own. The desires of those in Petrograd to the Ukrainian nationals was not something which could be accepted, though the Ukrainians did still believe in supporting the provincial government's bid for a Russian revolution. 31. The Central Rada in Kiev went through periods of supporting the provincial government, and then withdrawing that support. In their own words, we strongly oppose autonomy of Ukraine to the All-Russian Constituent Assembly. 32. Despite wanting to be in charge of their own country, of their own people, and of their own future, the Ukrainians had a difficult time finding the correct balance between going at it on their own and remaining close to those who controlled them for over 600 years. However, as the provincial government began to lose its grip over Russia leading up to the October Revolution, this sentiment began to change. On November 7 of 1917, the Central Rada issues yet another declaration of independence in response to the October Revolution. 30. Ukrainian National Republic, First Manifesto of Ukrainian Central Rada, June 10, 1917, Eurodocs, https://ukrist.at.ua/publ/2210-27331. Serhiy Yakelchik, The Ukrainian Meanings of 1918 and 1919, Harvard Ukrainian Studies 36, No. 1/2, 2019, 73-86, 75. 32. Ukrainian National Republic, Second Manifesto of Ukrainian Central Rada, July 3, 1917, Eurodocs, https://ukrist.at.ua/publ/2210-274, 16. The Ukrainian people, you, together with the fraternal peoples of Ukraine, set us to protect the rights gained through struggle, to create order and build a lifetime on our land, and we, the Ukrainian Central Council, by your will in the name of creating order in our country, in the name of saving the whole of Russia, announce, from now on, Ukraine becomes the Ukrainian People's Republic. 33. The Ukrainian People's Republic, an important distinction from an autonomous region of the new Russian state. When the spring of 1918 came to be, there was a new reality for the Ukrainians. Because of harsh Bolshevik reactions to the Ukrainians' response to their coup of the provisional government in October the previous year, Kyiv had been taken and the Central Rada was forced from Kyiv. In order to reacquire Ukraine from the Bolsheviks, the Ukrainians had to ask for assistance from Germany. The resulting counter-invasion, while technically a success, spelled doom for a truly independent Ukraine. With the Great War still waging in the West, the Austro-Hungarians and Germans were short on supplies. Most importantly, they were short on food. Though the Central Rada at first believed their allies would stay for a short time and then leave, this did not become the reality of the situation. 34. It did not take long for the established political order to break down. By April of 1918, a coup d'etat took place in the Central Rada, which was formed to support the ideas of the February Revolution and further the interests of the Ukrainian people, had collapsed. 33. Ukrainian National Republic, Third Manifesto of Ukrainian Central Rada, December 27, 1917, Eurodocs, https://ukrist.at.ua/publ/2210-27534. W. Bruce Lincoln, Red Victory, A History of the Russian Civil War, First Touchstone ed., New York, Simon & Schuster, 1991, 30408. 17. The Hetmanate government was a return to the conservatism of the past generations, more or less under a new name. Hetman had been a member of the imperial government, to a degree where he personally served Tsar Nicholas II during World War I. 35. He was a large landowner in Ukraine who formed a government which he tried to base on the old Cossack model from the 17th century. Despite having been placed in power with the help of the Central Powers, the Hetmanate did achieve national achievements. For instance, as Orest Subtelny points out, the Hetmanate established diplomatic ties with about a dozen nations and attempted to negotiate the Galician region of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. 36. However, because the Hetmanate was headed mostly by former aristocrats and conservatives looking to keep the Central Powers happy, they were not as progressive in other areas as the Central Rada. Having mentioned the influence of the Central Powers, Galicia and the emergence of the Ukrainian states are worth noting. At first, the Ukrainians of Galicia were no more than observers of the events going on in the newly established UNR. 37. However, the Austro-Hungarian Empire slowly began to decline, and when it was dissolved as an entity, the Ukrainians of Galicia found themselves in new territory. Galicia as a whole had sought nationalism within the Austrian, and later Austro-Hungarian, Empire, but in a sense were not proponents of full-fledged nationalism, much like how the Ukrainians in the East desired autonomy from Petrograd. But until the Bolsheviks coup did not want independence, the Ukrainians in Galicia had to a limited degree achieve the ability to pursue national interests, while having the stability of the Austrian Empire. When the 35 Orest Subtelny, Ukraine, A History, 356.36 Orest Subtelny, Ukraine, A History, 357, 37 Serhiy Yakelchik, Ukraine, Birth of a Modern Nation, 76. 18. Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed in 1918. Though now free to pursue national interests fully, the Ukrainians were thrust into a brand new world which was constantly changing. The night of October 31, 1918, the Ukrainians of Galicia made their first move towards full independence. On that night, the Sich riflemen captured the Galician capital of Lviv, and the next morning had a Ukrainian flag flying over the city. 38. At this point, the main threat to Ukrainian nationalism was not the Bolsheviks. Instead, it was the Poles. Ukrainian nationalism, for as long as it had existed in Galicia, was constantly in conflict with Polish nationalism. The Poles in the region were typically the landowning elite within the former Austrian province. Prior to Poland being partitioned for the first time, the Poles had enjoyed control over the native Ukrainian peasants. Now that Poland was a nation yet again, they sought no change for the power structure that was already in place. The Ukrainians in Galicia, however, now able to forge a new path, were no longer content with the Poles being the ones in charge of their land. Though capturing Lviv was the first salvo of Western Ukrainian nationalism, it was not the pinnacle of nationalism in the ZUNR. In late November, a government was established to represent the nearly 3 million Ukrainians in Galicia, based on old Austrian models. The ZUNR established order and a functioning bureaucracy. 39. The ZUNR was able to raise an army of 100,000 soldiers, essentially turning a former imperial province of a few million people into a functioning nation. In January of 1919, Ukrainian nationalism of the Ukrainian Revolution was able to unite the two Ukraines. 38 Orest Subtelny, Ukraine, A History, 367. 39 Orest Subtelny, Ukraine, A History, 368. 19. From now on, the centuries-old parts of Ukraine, Galicia, Bukovina, Transcarpathia and Dnieper Ukraine, merge into one greater Ukraine. The eternal dreams for which the best sons of Ukraine lived and died have come true. From now on, there is only one independent Ukrainian People's Republic. From now on, the Ukrainian people, liberated by a powerful impulse of their own forces, has the opportunity to unite all the efforts of their sons to create an indivisible independent Ukrainian state for the good and happiness of the Ukrainian people. 40. The realization that both states are in theory stronger together, the UNR and the ZNUR, unite. This was short-lived, however, due to infighting, invasion, and the situation Ukraine found itself in. The united Ukraine soon found themselves fighting French-backed Poles, whites looking to restore Tsarist institutions where possible, and the Bolsheviks in pursuit of those they found detrimental to their revolution. The invasions of three different armies are one of the likely causes for the failure of the Ukrainian People's Republic. With the Russian Civil War waging on between the Whites and the Reds, Ukraine was a key location. Both sides wanted desperately to claim Ukraine as their own. As a result of this, Ukraine experienced some of the most destruction and bloodshed of the war. 41 This fighting in Ukraine divided Ukrainian forces and politicians as it became clear that the Ukrainians would have to choose between one side or another. By 1920 the Ukrainians were facing collapse, though the Russian Civil War would go on for another year after the Ukrainian Revolution ended. By the conclusion of 40 Ukrainian National Republic Act of Directory reunifying all Ukrainian lands. Kyiv, January 22, 1919. Eurodocs. https://ukrist.at.ua/publ/221048. 41 W. Bruce Lincoln. Red Victory. A History of the Russian Civil War. 302. 20. The Civil War. The Ukraine state was crushed. The Bolsheviks claimed most of what had once been Russian Ukraine, incorporating it into the USSR as a socialist state. Poland received Galicia, and the Ukrainians there remained under their control until World War II. When Nazi Germany was defeated in 1945, the USSR united Galicia with the Ukrainian SSR. It was not until 1991 that Ukrainians were able to have another attempt at nationalism. Though the Ukrainian Revolution failed to create a Ukrainian state, it was a complete failure. The Ukrainian Revolution established that Ukraine could establish a state for their own people, one which was governed by their own nationalism and interests. And as Serhiy Yakelchik, the Ukrainian Revolution forced the Bolsheviks to grant Ukrainians their own SSR when they were engulfed into the USSR, which was a step in the direction of nationalism compared to what had been the case when controlled by other empires. 42. Ukrainian nationalism has a long and complex history. A complexity of Ukrainian nationalism is that there have been relatively few times it has been expressed in a manner conducive to allowing it to succeed. Ukrainian nationalism was allowed to be experimented with in the mid-negative 19th century, offering promising results and hope for the future. In the early 20th century, the idea of Ukrainian nationalism became a reality in the midst of the Russian Revolution and the aftermath of World War I, while important groundwork was laid in the years after the spring of 1848. The Ukrainians of 1917 to 1921 were unable to create a lasting state based on previous ideas of Ukrainian nationalism. The importance of studying the past of Ukrainian nationalism is clear because of current world events. Since the founding of an independent Ukraine in 1991, the concept of nationalism for the state and the people has been in question. Notable by Vladimir. 42 Serhiy Yakelchik. Ukraine, Birth of a Modern Nation. 84. 21. Putin of Russia, who on multiple occasions displayed utter lack of recognition of Ukrainian nationalism. In 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, there was a consensus that Ukraine would throw down their arms and welcome Russians into the land of blue and yellow. That, however, was not the case. Ukrainians have forged their own identity and seek to maintain their own national identity. Historically, the Ukrainians have been ignored or suppressed as a people. Learning about their history will hopefully counter the ability for others to do it in the modern day. This essay has covered a complex topic to the best of its ability. There are historians who have devoted whole books and their careers to answering the question of what is Ukrainian nationalism, through examining the development of Ukrainian nationalism as a result of the revolutions of 1848 and the Ukrainian Revolution as a result of the February Revolution. I have sought to explain where it came from, what influenced it, and what it developed into. The Ukrainians are a proud people. Though nationalism for Ukrainians may have failed in the 19th and 20th century, their sense of nationalism still persists to this day, even in the face of invasion, political manipulation, cultural genocide. The foundations for this new nationalism seen today was laid when Ukrainians began to experiment as a subjugated people, attempting to figure out where they fit into the world as a people. 22. Applebaum, Anne. Red Famine. Stalin's War on Ukraine. New York. Doubleday. 2017. Delwade. Jacobus. Identity and Geopolitics. Ukraine's Grappling with Imperial Legacies. Harvard Ukrainian Studies 32/33. 2011. 179-207. Full stop. Kenez, Peter. Civil War in South Russia, 1919 to 1920. The Defeat of the Whites. Berkeley. Published for the Hoover Institution on War, Revolution, and Peace by University of California Press. 1977. Lincoln, W. Bruce. Red Victory, A History of the Russian Civil War. First Touchstone ed. New York. Simon & Schuster, 1991. Magoxi, Paul R. The Roots of Ukrainian Nationalism. Galicia as Ukraine as Piedmont. Toronto, University of Toronto Press, 2002. Nestor the Chronicler, The Russian Primary Chronicle Laurentian Text. Trans Samuel Hazard Cross and Olgerd P. Sherbowitz-Wetzer, Cambridge, The Medieval Academy of America, 1953. Remy, Johannes. It is unknown where the Little Russians are heading to. The autonomy dispute between the Ukrainian Central Rada and the All-Russian Provisional Government in 1917. The Slavonic and East European Review 95, number 4, 2017, 691-719. Full stop. Subtelny, Orist, Ukraine, A History. Toronto, published by the University of Toronto Press in association with the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, 1988. Ukrainian National Republic, First Manifesto of Ukrainian Central Rada, June 10, 1917, Eurodocs. Full stop. Ukrainian National Republic, Second Manifesto of Ukrainian Central Rada, July 3, 1917, Eurodocs. Full stop. Ukrainian National Republic, Third Manifesto of Ukrainian Central Rada, December 27, 1917, Eurodocs. Full stop. Ukrainian National Republic, Act of Directory reunifying all Ukrainian lands, Kyiv, January 22, 1919, Eurodocs. https://ukrist.at.ua/publ/221048. Yakelchik, Serhiy. The Ukrainian Meanings of 1918 and 1919. Harvard Ukrainian Studies 36, number 1/2, 2019, 73-86. Full stop. Yakelchik, Serhiy. Ukraine, Birth of a Modern Nation. Oxford, Oxford University Press, 2007.